All right, in this video, we are looking at T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland in comparison specifically to Stephen King's The Dark Tower series. We are reading this before starting The Wastelands, the third book in the series, with the idea of let's compare this poem juggernaut to what we know of the Stephen King series so far and kind of talk about what similarities do we see, and is it worth your time reading if you're a huge fan of the Dark Tower series.
Are you leaving in that groan?
It's possible. That groan is going to be pretty representative of how I feel about this. All right, guys. Welcome to the CodeX Cantina. I am Una.
And I am not a poet, Crypto.
I am not a poet, Una. And we went through this, though, but we went through this not because we're like, hey, let's start with a juggernaut behemoth in the poem postmodern landscape. Like, that's not our intent. Yeah. Our intent was we heard this influence, the Dark Tower series. Let's look at it through these eyes, but we also recognize the limitations that you and I have of we don't have a lot of tools when it comes to poetry in terms of how we break it down, right?
Yeah, I'll be very frank and honest. I don't enjoy poetry. I guess I'm ill-equipped to break down the meanings, and I think that there's just too much interpretation in poetry to get a true understanding of a poet or writers.
Yeah, so let's talk about what we did see.
Okay.
So this was published in 1922 in the Criterion, and being so old you can read or actually listen to for free, have Obi Wan Kenobi, Alec Guiness himself, read it to you.
These are not the poems you're looking for.
All right, so first of all, I would say I don't think when I read this, okay,
yeah,
this is not a plot inspiration for the Wastelands or the Dark Tower series on a whole. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes, 100%. I don't think that... I don't even know if really it inspired, but I agree with that statement.
I'm not sure who told me it was inspired or where I read that, if at all, but I did pick up on some similarities in terms of literary techniques or themes. Let's go through those real quick, because our goal, again, is not to break down this poem, but to say, like, hey, we're really into literature, more so than I think even the average Stephen King fan. Would an average Stephen King fan or a guy who's into literary goals, but not necessarily into poems, would this be a good thing to throw into the repertoire? So let's go through some of the similarities that we noticed first. So first, disjointed timelines.
Yeah, so in the book, or the Dark Tower series, you have all of these different timelines. If you haven't been watching our series, you can go back and watch those videos. And we're starting the third book of the series, and you have all of these different times, and you have all these different worlds, and that's not too much spoiler, but it continues to grow even further from here, and the poem itself seems very disjointed. I like that word. Yeah,
there's no central driving narrative. There's kind of these 5 sections. And like you said with Stephen King, not only does he go to different timelines, for example, in The Drawing of Three in terms of the 60s, 70s, 80s, they even say time doesn't work exactly the same, and it's a little bit weird when they're talking about lengths of time in that book. So that definitely, whether he grabbed that from this poem or not, doesn't matter. That's a very specific similarity that I definitely noticed. Another thing is language, right? When you read The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, he will throw in German, French, I believe. I'm not sure if there's Latin, but there's Old English where he specifically pulls out even quotes from Shakespeare. I noticed when I was reading this.
Yeah, I felt it was very jarring in the Eliot poem, especially when it just kept going like to French all the time. And it's a beautiful language, but it's hard to follow along. But I don't know that language, and it's very similar to how King writes when he puts in his fancy words because he loves his thesaurus, but also he's created his own language sort of with the high speech or the noble speech, I guess you could think of it as.
I noticed also it seemed to be a heavy influence here because I kind of wonder where he's going. Like the tarot cards, they're a narrative guideline in that. And I noticed that in page 3 of this, they immediately bring us in with the drowned sailor, which was Jake, right? They talked about the pearls in his eyes. Remember when we were reading Gunslinger?
Yeah.
And he talked about him looking like an alabaster saint?
Yeah, so pearl alabaster.
Yeah,
Very
I
similar.
I wonder if there's something there with that, something to think about. But they talk about the Lady of the Rocks. We have the Lady of the Shadows, of course, card. The Three Staves, the Wheel, One-Eyed Merchant. And the Hanged Man, Fear Death by Water. So I think he definitely maybe took some of the tarot card sections of this and was kind of inspired by it and kind of took it in a new direction with his books, don't you think?
Yeah, definitely. So the individuals that are represented by the different symbols are very closely linked to what is in the poem. I think that I don't know if it's necessarily the cards, the tarot cards themselves, but the symbology is definitely a good connection between the poem and the book.
Yeah, and another thing is stream of conscious writing. There's a whole section in here that's just stream of conscious. And if you remember, I pointed it out when we were doing our drawing of 3 reading. It was really weird to see kind of like a pulp fiction book use stream of conscious writing in the data section, if you remember that. Because I remember when we were reading it with another group, they were kind of put off by that. They're like, why is this writing so weird? It's a different technique.
Yeah, and this is something in the poem that is also hard to comprehend, especially when it's the stream of consciousness is not a narrative in the sense that it's not dialogue. Somebody isn't talking. And then being that it's in a poem form as well, and then on top of all the other things that we just said a second ago, it is really hard to follow. And so that can be off-putting.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the other things I noticed too is just descriptions of the landscape. April was the cruelest month. Usually you think of April bringing life, showers and stuff like that. But you'll notice there was a scene in the desert. Yeah. There was a scene with London Tower falling, with the world going into this wasteland, as in the world ain't what it used to be.
The world's moved on. Yeah.
The world has moved on.
The world has moved on. The Dark Tower series. Yeah. I mean, the whole thing starts, right? Man fled across the desert, or the Man in Black, and the gunslinger followed. So yeah, I think that even if you didn't read it somewhere and you just made that up, obviously King read these poems by Eliot, and he is, I don't want to say inspired, but he definitely was loosely influenced. I don't even feel like that. For sure. I don't even know if that's right. Influence might be too strong of a word. But
I mean, he named his 3rd book The Wastelands.
Yeah. But I don't see the connection between the story and that book.
It's not a plot similarity, right? I think it's just a love letter of these are things that he loved from the T.S. Eliot poem, which would take probably some more formal training than what you and I have in poems to break down on the level that you and I typically do with books.
Yeah.
So with that said, something that really... So I'm just going to go into a couple things that I didn't care for those that typically just read prose literature. There were allusions out the wazoo here. Now, I have read Shakespeare. I have read a lot of these older literary works, and I recognize some of them. But to what end? Sometimes he'd make a reference where I knew that was from The Tempest. I've read The Tempest by Shakespeare. But the way in which he was using it here, I wasn't sure why he would pull that quote in. It just didn't make sense for me. So I just felt like there was too many allusions for the average reader to take this as an enjoyable read as opposed to a study read. Even from my perspective.
Yeah, but even as a study read, it's hard to take those things, take a quote to support a claim, to say, all right, well, he's using this as a method to teach you about X, Y, and Z, or he's using this to further the narrative, or he's using this to teach you about this character, or this setting, or this plot device. It's like he is just putting his stream of consciousness in there. I don't know, he smoked some peyote and just got on his typewriter, I feel like, sometimes.
Well, to be fair, we don't do poetry, so
yeah,
we can't technically break it down the way that it's supposed to be. But so I'll say this. If I were a Stephen King fan, or even just you're really into literary fiction, and you're like, well, should I check out this poem? If you're not already into poetry, I'm going to say very easily just no. I didn't take a lot from this. I liked some of the influence. Like, I could see the love letter to this that Stephen King had, but I don't think this will really enrich my current enjoyment of the Dark Tower series, if that makes sense.
Definitely makes sense. I would agree with that statement and just say that as the CodeX Cantina, I don't really want to rank this because I don't think it's fair to the poem, and I don't think it's fair to the literary work that it is, because it's not something for me.
Well, we also don't have the tools to do it.
Yeah.
Right? Like, if I were to ask my 4-year-old son to, rank or discuss the efficiencies of my 4-cylinder engine, he doesn't have the training to even understand how it works. That's me in this poem. So with that said, maybe 10, 15 years from now, if I were to suddenly get into poetry, I would come back and revisit this. But right now, where I am, this is definitely a skip it for me.
Even if you're a super uber Stephen King Dark Tower series fanatic, you don't need to read this. It's not going to help you enjoy the Dark Tower series any more than you probably already do. So take that for what it's worth.
If you have the skills to break this down, you're probably just fine on your own with Dark Tower.
Yes.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for checking this out. I'm really sorry that we decided to do a poem.
Not as sorry as I am, or we are.
Maybe if we had done a different poem. This is obviously just way too advanced for us for where we are in our level with breaking it down.
Yeah, we need to.
But thank you so much. Thank you so much for checking us out. Please consider subscribing when we do our actual literary breakdowns. And as we continue down on our Dark Tower series, we'd love for you to join us.
Peace.